Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the information you're reading and listening to and, well, boil it down to what truly matters. For this session, our mission is pretty direct and, frankly, a bit unsettling. We're going to dissect a comprehensive report on global security in 2025 and try to identify the most credible paths to a potential Third World War.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, and it's definitely driven by this palpable sense of global anxiety right now. The report we looked at certainly reinforces that feeling. It points to the Council on Foreign Relations Preventive Priority Survey for 2025, and that survey registered just an unprecedented number of high-stakes global contingencies, events both very likely and carrying major impact. The global risk landscape is looking, well, exceptionally turbulent.
Absolutely. And you see that same sense of heightened danger echoed elsewhere, right? Like
Yeah.
the World Economic Forum's 2025 Global Risks Report. They actually named conflict as the single most pressing threat.
Oh, they did. And they highlighted a record number of armed conflicts in 2023. Plus, this deeply concerning surge in civilian fatalities. So it's not just about isolated hotspots anymore.
Right. It feels more systemic, a kind of global instability creeping up.
And what's really critical to understand, and the report stresses this, is the interconnected nature of these crises. These aren't isolated events happening in silos. They're intertwined, and they're actually amplifying each other. We're looking at what the report calls a brittle global order, meaning its capacity to absorb big shocks is severely diminished because it's already under so much strain on multiple fronts.
Okay, so against this backdrop overlapping crises, growing unease, the report maps out the key conflict zones, the potential ignition points that kind of set the stage for this analysis. We're talking about, obviously, Ukraine and the wider European security picture. Then the Middle East, which is always volatile, but thinking specifically about Israel, Palestine, Iran, Lebanon, Syria.
A complex web there, definitely.
And then the Indo-Pacific, big focus on the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula.
Crucial theaters.
And we can't ignore other areas, right? The instability in Sudan and the Horn of Africa, even the complexities at the U.S.-Mexico border, and the really deeply concerning situation in Myanmar.
It's a stark list. Just the sheer number of potential flashpoints.
And each one, as the report outlines, has its own distinct escalation risks, its own set of major players involved.
Exactly. In Ukraine, the big fear is a direct Russian-NATO clash. Middle East. It's that intricate mix of state versus non-state actors, potentially dragging in regional and global powers.
And the Indo-Pacific, that's dominated by the U.S.-China dynamic, isn't it? Especially Taiwan.
Absolutely. High stakes doesn't even begin to cover it there. Sudan shows how internal conflict can blow up regionally. The U.S.-Mexico border has its own security and migration challenges, and Myanmar, sadly, is just a tragic example of internal strife with wider implications.
Okay, so we have the hotspots. How do we get from these simmering tensions to something potentially boiling over into a world war? The report identifies three key underlying forces. It calls them an accelerant triangle of global instability. What are the points of that triangle?
Right. The three core accelerants they identify are, first, intensifying great power competition, along with shifting alliances. Second, the rapid advancement and spread of disruptive military technologies. And third, a really significant element of political unpredictability, especially concerning the actions of the major.
Let's unpack that first. Great power competition. The report really seems to put the U.S.-China rivalry front and center, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It underscores U.S.-China strategic competition as pretty much the defining feature of geopolitics right now. And when you look at potential military flashpoints, Taiwan just consistently emerges as the area of greatest concern.
I saw that statistic from the Atlantic Council survey they mentioned.
Yeah, it's striking. 65% of experts expect a Chinese attempt to retake Taiwan by force within the next decade.
65%. That's, wow.
Right. That figure alone tells you Taiwan isn't just a potential crisis. It's viewed as a looming systemic risk.
And this competition, it's not purely military, is it? There's this whole economic dimension too, decoupling, de-risking, all that.
Exactly. The rivalry runs deep into the economic realm. You see ongoing trade disputes, intense competition over critical tech like semiconductors, and these deliberate efforts by both sides to reduce their economic interdependence. Basically trying to lessen vulnerabilities if things do turn hot.
Then you've got Russia. The report uses the term revanchism for its motivations. The war in Ukraine has certainly thrown that into sharp relief.
Yes, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is seen as part of this broader pushback against the post-Cold War order in Europe. And the report notes there's this growing expectation or maybe fear of a direct military clash between Russia and NATO. Again, you see this reflected in surveys of strategic experts. The anxiety level is high.
And the report talks about Russia's Gerasimov doctrine. What's the core idea there, and why is it so significant in this context?
Well, what's fascinating and concerning about the Gerasimov doctrine is its central idea. Strategically integrating non-military means political, economic, info ops, cyber, right alongside conventional military force. It's about achieving strategic goals, often below the threshold of triggering a major military response.
So it blurs the lines between peace and war.
Precisely. And that blurring fundamentally raises the risk of miscalculation. Traditional deterrence gets harder because it's not always clear what constitutes an attack or aggression anymore. The lines are fuzzy.
The third piece of this great power dynamic is the growing cooperation among what the report calls the axis of revisionists. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Not a formal alliance, but it sounds like a significant alignment.
That's a good way to put it. While it's not a formal treaty alliance like NATO, these nations share a common interest in pushing back against the current U.S.-led global order. And we're seeing very tangible cooperation. Think Iranian and North Korean arms going to Russia for Ukraine. And crucial economic support from China, helping Russia weather Western sanctions. The report actually notes that nearly half of the experts surveyed expect this cooperation might evolve into something more formalized in the coming years.
A formal alliance.
Yeah.
That would be a major shift.
Huge implications for global power dynamics, yes.
Okay, let's pivot to the second point of that accelerant triangle. Evolving military doctrines and capabilities. It feels like everyone's adapting their approach to warfare. The report mentions the U.S. National Defense Strategy for 2025. What are the expected priorities there?
So the report anticipates a few key things for the NDS 2025. A reinforced focus on homeland defense, think better missile defense, things like that. Alongside that, continued priority on deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. That remains central. But interestingly, also an expected increased emphasis on burden sharing with allies.
Burden sharing, so asking allies to do more.
Essentially, yes. It suggests we might see allies taking on more direct security responsibilities in their own regions, could shift the dynamics of how the U.S. engages globally.
And what about China's military modernization? The report talks about aiming for a world-class military in this idea of intelligentized warfare. What's that about?
China's PLA is undergoing just a massive, rapid modernization across the board, and intelligentized warfare is central to it. It means deeply integrating things like AI, big data analytics, quantum computing, autonomous systems into military operations. They're also making huge strides in advanced missiles, including hypersonics, and, already have the world's largest navy by ship count.
So while the U.S. might be adjusting focus, China's pedal to the metal on tech advancement. We touched on Russia's Gerasimov doctrine, but the report brings it up again here in the context of capabilities. Why reiterate that?
It's crucial because it represents a distinct and actively used method of conflict, that hybrid approach, blending non-military and military tactics to achieve goals below that threshold of a major response. It creates this persistent tension, and it significantly bumps up the risk of miscalculation. It's a strategy designed to exploit ambiguity, operate in that gray zone where clear red lines are harder to define.
Okay, the third point of the triangle, emerging technologies. This feels like a real wild card. Potential for progress, but also, obviously, significant danger. Let's start with artificial intelligence, AI and military decision-making. Benefits, sure, but what are the serious risks the report flags?
Right. AI offers potential gains in speed, efficiency, processing huge amounts of data. That's the upside. But the risks are substantial, and the report lays them out clearly. Concerns about uncontrolled escalation, AI acting faster than humans can manage in a crisis, the problem of automation bias, where people might over-rely on flawed AI systems.
Trusting the machine too much.
Exactly. Then there's the opacity issue, complex algorithms making decisions that are hard to understand or scrutinize. How do you verify? Vulnerability to hacking, manipulation, the potential erosion of critical human skills in warfare if we offload too much, and of course the profound ethical dilemmas around lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, essentially.
Right.
Critically, AI could just dramatically compress decision times in a crisis. That increases the danger of inadvertent escalation based on bad or misinterpreted data.
A chilling thought. Then you have hypersonic missiles, generating a lot of buzz, a lot of concern globally. What makes them so destabilizing?
Well, the main issue with hypersonics is their combination of extreme speed, we're talking Mach 5+, and maneuverability. This makes them incredibly difficult for current missile defense systems to track and intercept. They can change course unpredictably.
Hard to shoot down.
Very. But perhaps the biggest danger is what the report calls payload ambiguity, because their flight path doesn't necessarily tell you if they're carrying a conventional warhead or a nuclear one.
Yeah.
This drastically shorter warning time, plus the uncertainty about the payload, it could incentivize preemptive strikes.
You hit first because you don't know what's coming.
Or it could lead to these hair-trigger launch-on-warning postures. Both significantly raise the risk of accidental nuclear war. It's hugely destabilizing.
And the final tech piece the report emphasizes is the weaponization of space. I think many people still see space as, scientific exploration.
Unfortunately, that perception is changing fast. Major powers are actively developing counter-space capabilities, ways to disable or destroy satellites. Space is increasingly seen as a potential warfighting domain.
And the impact wouldn't stay in space, would it?
Absolutely not. Think about how much critical infrastructure relies on satellites, communication, navigation, GPS, financial transactions, even military early warning systems. An attack in space could have devastating effects down here on Earth and could easily trigger or escalate conflicts on the ground. That Atlantic Council survey finding, again, nearly half of experts think space will be a military domain within a decade. That tells you the direction things are heading.
Sobering. Okay, the report then shifts gears a bit, away from tech to something equally potent, the Trump factor, and political unpredictability more broadly. How does this feed into the risk of global conflict?
Well, the central concern highlighted is that potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, particularly under a returning Donald Trump administration, characterized by skepticism towards long-standing alliances, a more transactional approach, maybe abrupt policy changes, this could significantly destabilize existing global security structures.
How so?
This unpredictability can sow doubt among U.S. allies about Washington's reliability, its commitments. Will the U.S. show up? At the same time, it could potentially embolden adversaries. They might see an opportunity to test U.S. resolve or exploit perceived weaknesses. All of this just increases the chances of dangerous miscalculations on all sides. It introduces a major element of uncertainty.
Right. And finally, before we get into specific war scenarios, the report mentions the erosion of international norms, weakening institutions, even less money for conflict prevention. It sounds like the guardrails are coming off.
That's a critical point, yes. The report underscores this worrying trend. Less respect for established norms against aggression, fewer resources going into preventing conflicts before they start. You also see this increasing geopoliticization of conflicts, regional disputes getting tangled up in great power rivalries, and overall a declining commitment to multilateralism, to working through international institutions. All this actively weakens the very safeguards meant to prevent large-scale war.
So we've had this really complex, volatile backdrop. Flashpoints, intense rivalries, disruptive tech, political uncertainty, weakening norms. The report then turns to the most plausible pathways to World War III, making the point that traditional deterrence isn't working as well anymore.
Indeed. New technologies create strategic uncertainty. Hybrid warfare operates in that ambiguous gray zone. Multipolarity complicates power dynamics. Political unpredictability erodes trust. All these things collectively weaken the traditional deterrence strategies that, helped keep a very fragile peace for decades. They're less reliable now.
Okay, so the first big scenario the report outlines is cascading conflicts. The classic domino effect idea. How could a regional war go global this way?
Right. The scenario suggests a major regional war, likely starting either in Ukraine involving NATO or the Indo-Pacific with the U.S. and China over Taiwan, could trigger a cascade. It happens through two main mechanisms, according to the report. First, alliance entanglement. Think NATO's Article 5, or U.S. treaty commitments in the Pacific to allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. An attack on one could automatically draw others in.
The tripwires.
Exactly. The second mechanism is opportunistic aggression. Other powers might exploit the fact that major players are distracted and potentially weakened by a conflict elsewhere. For instance, Russia might escalate in Europe if the U.S. is heavily engaged with China, or China might move on Taiwan if the U.S. is tied down in a NATO-Russia war. This two-front dilemma.
One crisis creates an opening for another.
Precisely. The report even references a Rand Corporation scenario showing how interconnected crises could spiral unexpectedly. This opportunistic cascade model really highlights how these rivalries create systemic risk.
It's a truly alarming idea, one regional fire setting off a global chain reaction. And the report notes there's significant expert concern about this.
Yes, citing an Atlantic Council report finding that I think it was 40%, expect another world war by 2035. The strategic community is definitely worried about a multi-front great power war emerging from what might seem like a localized conflict.
Okay, the second scenario is miscalculation and unintended escalation in a core flashpoint.
This feels almost sneakier, maybe. Not necessarily starting with a big deliberate invasion.
That's right. This focuses on how misjudgment by leaders, tech failures, accidents, or just misinterpreting ambiguous actions in a really tense zone could lead to rapid, uncontrolled escalation.
How could that happen? Well, the report points to a few pathways. One is technological failure or AI-driven misjudgment. We talked about AI risks, flawed algorithms, decisions made too fast in a crisis triggering unintended responses. Or think about hypersonic missiles compressing decision times, increasing the risk of mistaken retaliation based on faulty early warning.
A glitch causing a war.
It's a terrifying possibility. Another pathway is the ambiguity of hybrid warfare. Attacks below the conventional threshold, cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation, unattributed forces. It's hard to know who did it, how to respond appropriately, you risk overreacting.
Right, the gray zone problem again.
And the third is simply accidental clashes in contested areas. Naval ships bumping, aircraft encounters gone wrong in places like the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, the Baltic, the Black Sea. These incidents could escalate fast due to political pressure, national honor, things like that. RAND scenarios mentioned include aggressive Russian maneuvers or even strikes in Ukraine accidentally killing NATO officials, sparking wider conflict.
The report included a useful table summarizing how different think tanks see these WW3 drivers. Are there common threads when you compare their analyses?
Yeah, looking across institutions like Atlantic Council, RAND, ICG, CFR, Stimson, WEF, several themes really stand out. Taiwan and Ukraine, consistently identified as the most dangerous flashpoints, no surprise there. Great power competition, especially U.S.-China rivalry, is seen as the fundamental underlying driver. The disruptive impact of emerging tech, particularly AI and hypersonics, is a major shared concern. Big destabilizer. And finally, that pervasive element of political unpredictability, especially around future U.S. foreign policy, is highlighted everywhere as a significant risk factor that could just pour fuel on existing tensions.
Okay, so synthesizing all this analysis, the flashpoints, the drivers, the scenarios, what does the report ultimately identify as the most likely scenario for how World War III could actually start?
The report concludes that the most probable path is a cascading, multi-front great power conflict. It suggests such a war would most likely ignite from a severe escalation in one of two key theaters, either the Indo-Pacific, specifically a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan, or in Europe, a direct NATO-Russia military confrontation spinning out of the war in Ukraine. And the key dynamic driving it global is that opportunistic cascade model we discussed. An initial major crisis creates vulnerabilities, diversions, which other powers then actively exploit to push their own agendas, leading to a rapid spread of the conflict across multiple regions.
And how does the report break down the potential phases of this primary cascading scenario? How might it unfold?
It outlines three overlapping phases. Phase 1 is the initial major power crisis and escalation. This could follow Path A, Indo-Pacific, maybe Chinese action against Taiwan blockade, cyber missile strikes, maybe invasion, very likely triggers U.S. intervention, draws in allies like Japan, Australia, you'd see high-tech conflict, significant losses. Or Path B, European, escalation of the Ukraine war into direct NATO-Russia conflict. Could be spillover, miscalculation in the Baltic Black Sea, a severe hybrid attack triggering Article 5. Leads to direct fighting in Eastern Europe.
Okay, so one of those fires starts first. Then phase 2 is where it spreads.
Exactly. Phase 2 is opportunistic exploitation and second front opening. If the U.S. is heavily engaged with China over Taiwan, maybe Russia sees an opening to escalate further in Europe. Conversely, if NATO and Russia are in a major war, perhaps China views it as the opportune moment to move on Taiwan, with the U.S. distracted and potentially weakened. It's this opening of a second major front, simultaneously or nearly so, that really defines the cascade.
And phase 3, that sounds like the descent into total global conflict.
Yes. Phase 3 is global conflagration entanglement of other powers and domains. This is where it truly goes global. The axis of revisionists, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea likely provide mutual support, stretching U.S. and allied resources thin. You could see Iran escalating the Middle East, proxy attacks, direct action, disrupting oil, maybe pushing its nuclear program.
The Middle East front opens up.
Potentially.
Yeah.
North Korea might seize the chance for aggression against South Korea, and crucially, this phase would likely see a rapid technological escalation across domains. More AI in warfare, hypersonics used, widespread cyber attacks hitting critical infrastructure everywhere, and the full weaponization of space, causing massive disruption. And tragically, the report stresses, this final phase carries an exceptionally high risk of nuclear weapons use as major powers face what they perceive as existential threats.
The report took a specific look at China's thinking. If a NATO-Russia war breaks out, what's their likely calculus?
It's complex for China. Outwardly, they might maintain this sort of discursive strategic neutrality talking piece, but they've provided crucial economic and tech support to Russia already. Why? Largely to prevent a Russian collapse, which would significantly strengthen the U.S. in their view. China's main game is still the long-term rivalry with the U.S. and its ambitions regarding Taiwan. They have red lines, nuclear use, major instability in Central Asia near their border, but the report suggests China might deepen its involvement if it looks like Russia is facing a truly decisive defeat that would fundamentally hurt China's position versus the West long-term. Ultimately, though, their actions are driven by that core rivalry with the U.S. and their Taiwan goals.
And the report loops back to the Trump factor here as a wild card influencing this whole cascading scenario.
Right. A potential shift in U.S. foreign policy under a returning Trump administration. That unpredictability about alliances, the transactional approach, it just injects massive uncertainty into these already volatile dynamics. Could it accelerate escalation? Maybe. By creating confusion, emboldening adversaries who miscalculate the U.S. response? Could it lead to unforeseen realignments? Also possible. But the report seems to lean towards a risk that in this environment, unpredictability is more likely to fuel instability.
So we've walked through these potential pathways. The picture painted by this deep dive is, well, undeniably stark, deeply concerning. What are the big overarching strategic implications if this kind of cascading multi-front war actually happened?
The implications are, frankly, almost unimaginable. Catastrophic doesn't quite cover it. You're looking at unprecedented levels of destruction, potentially dwarfing previous world wars given modern weaponry, a very real, significantly heightened risk of nuclear weapons being used. Likely global economic collapse, with consequences lasting for generations, and probably the complete disintegration of the international order as we know it, leading into an era of profound, dangerous instability.
The report really hammers the need for integrated deterrence across domains, across regions. But it also admits traditional deterrence is struggling.
Exactly. A comprehensive, integrated approach to deterrence is more vital than ever. But as the report stresses, the current environment, rapid tech change, hybrid warfare blurring lines, multipolarity, political uncertainty, it all poses fundamental challenges to those traditional models that rely on clear red lines and predictable responses. They're just not as effective.
So given all that, what are the most urgent priorities? What needs to happen to try and prevent this kind of catastrophe?
Well, the report really underscores the urgent need to strengthen diplomatic channels. Communication, de-escalation mechanisms, they need to be robust. Ensuring clear, unambiguous communication of red lines between the major powers is critical. Misunderstandings are deadly here. Establishing reliable ways to manage crises before they spiral out of control. But realistically, the report also acknowledges the huge obstacles, the erosion of norms, the weakening of institutions that are supposed to facilitate this kind of cooperation. It makes it all much harder.
It keeps coming back to that interconnectedness we talked about at the start, doesn't it? Global security risks are all tangled together.
Precisely. The report concludes that preventing large-scale conflict in this environment demands a truly holistic approach. It requires genuine, sustained coordination among allies, and it even requires engaging with adversaries on these existential threats that, frankly, transcend immediate geopolitical squabbles. A piecemeal approach just won't cut it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into a really critical and unsettling topic, here's maybe a final thought for you, our listener. Even if no major power actually wants a global war, the dangerous convergence we've discussed, great power ambitions, disruptive tech, political unpredictability, has created this perilously brittle global order. Now, in this kind of environment, a cascade of events, each perhaps seeming manageable on its own, could still lead to a catastrophic unintended global conflict. It really compels us to think hard about how we as a global community navigate this incredibly complex and dangerous landscape, shaped by this accelerant triangle of ambition, technology, and unpredictability.